So far in this chapter, we've already discussed cognition or thinking, as well as language. So we have the ability to think in complex ways, we have the ability to communicate with each other, but individually speaking, our ability to do those things varies. And so what we're getting at here is intelligence. There is a range of intelligence among the population of human beings. So let's talk about what intelligence is first and foremost, at least from a definitional standpoint. It is the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and use knowledge to adapt to new situations. All right, so I think we all have a very abstract, basic idea of what intelligence is. You might be walking down the street and looking at someone and saying, wow, that's not a very intelligent person based on some behavior that you observed. But the idea is that intelligence is really complex. And we're going to have to basically separate it. Is it just one thing? Or does intelligence mean a number of things for different people, for example? So before we get to that, let's think about the concept of why we should even measure intelligence. Today, there are many intelligence tests in existence. And they all should be standardized, reliable, and valid. So let's cover what that means. Standardized. To take a 5-year-old and measure their intelligence, we need to figure out what an average 5-year-old's intelligence looks like to begin with. That's what we mean by standardized. You wouldn't compare a 5-year-old's ability to take a test to a 25-year-old's on the same test. No, you compare 25-year-olds to other adults, 5-year-olds to other children. This is what's known as standardization. And on this slide right here, you see the bell curve. Plenty of information about the bell curve in the textbook. If you've ever taken a statistics class, you know all about the bell curve. But what it basically shows is that within a population, let's say within a group of 10,000 children of age 5, the spread of intelligence is going to look something like that. Most of the children, about 68%, fall near the average. The average is standardized for humans to be 100 points of IQ. But as you see, as you get higher and higher on the IQ score, the amount of children who are in that category gets lower and lower. In other words, there are probably children who have an IQ of 145 or higher, but that's incredibly rare. Most children do not have genius level IQ. On the flip side, there are children who have very low IQ, 55 and lower, which is basically having an intellectual disability. There are children who have disabilities, but that's rare. Most of the children within a population are going to be near the average. All right, so why is that important? Well, intelligence tests have only been around for 100 or 150 years. So the basic history, as far as in psychology, is that in France, the government decided it was mandatory for children to go to school. And so at that time, there was a problem that the government had to face, which was, where do we place children in the appropriate context so that they will succeed? In other words, if I have a 5-year-old who has never gone to school, should that 5-year-old be placed with other 5-year-olds who have gone to school, or a 10-year-old, or a 15-year-old? If these children have never gone to school, we need an intelligence test to identify where they are, intellectually speaking, so that we can basically put them in the developmentally appropriate context. So intelligence tests, I think, started off in terms of overall just trying to identify children who are behind the curve, giving them the extra support they need. Even also, though, identifying children who are ahead of the curve and giving them, support for their gift, if you will. Okay, so beyond standardization, IQ tests have to be reliable and valid. Reliability refers to the idea of consistency. If I take a test and it says my IQ score is 100, and I take a similar test tomorrow and it says that my IQ is 20, there's something going on with reliability. We have to have a test that is consistent. And finally, valid. Valid means accuracy. You have to have an IQ test that actually measures intelligence as opposed to, I don't know, something else like effort or something. So you have to have tests that are standardized, reliable, and valid. And as we'll see, there's a number of problems, particularly with validity or accuracy. So we'll come back to that at the end. All right. So an overarching question in psychology is intelligence one thing or is it multiple things? And there are two theories that get discussed time and time again in this realm. So the first is Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence. This guy, Lawrence Sternberg, believed that we all have a mix of three types of intelligence, and some of us have more of one than the other. And so we should develop IQ tests that basically tap into different forms of intelligence. Whereas, one might argue that IQ tests today, on average, typically only measure one type. And let's get into it. So the first is analytical intelligence, which is basically another way of saying book smarts. Critics pretty much argue that most IQ tests only measure this type of intelligence, the analytical intelligence. And certainly this is important in a number of domains. For example, I want my doctors and my engineers, my accountants, I want them to have a high level of analytical intelligence. But there's so many other avenues of success in our society that don't rely on analytical intelligence. So let's go to the next one, practical intelligence. That is more about street smarts, the ability to adapt, to shape. Think about a salesperson or a marketing person. If you are somebody who, makes a living in sales, you know that you have to adapt your sales pitch depending on the client. You can't use the same pitch every single time. It's not going to be as successful as adapting. So you have to be able to mold yourself, the ability to read people and adapt accordingly. That is intelligence, but you can't always learn that from a textbook. So that's a different type of intelligence, according to Sternberg. And then finally, creative intelligence, the ability to create something new and appropriate. Obviously, an artist would have a high level of creative intelligence, a musician as well. But, again, going back to maybe a marketing person, somebody who is a marketing executive, they have to create new ideas, new ways of selling products or advertising products depending on the audience, for example. So basically, according to Sternberg, we each have a blend of these three, but psychologists might argue that an intelligence test would be better off measuring each of these separately to find our strengths and weaknesses. So for example, if we're talking about students in school, this could help teachers figure out how to tailor their lesson plans to children's, strengths and weaknesses. All right. Another researcher, Gardner, also argues for the idea of multiple intelligences. So Gardner argued that there's 8 different types of intelligence. I'm not going to read those all for you. I think you can do that on your own. But let's just look at 1 or 2 maybe. So linguistic intelligence. An example might be a poet, somebody who can take words and manipulate them in beautiful ways and, describe something in a beautiful manner. That requires a high level of intelligence. But specifically, linguistic intelligence, taking words and communicating in ways that are superior to other people. But that's very different than, let's say, Einstein, of course, but also number 5, bodily kinesthetic intelligence. So Martha Graham, a very successful and famous dancer, she has the ability to move in ways that tell a story and, very successfully so. So isn't that intelligence? Well, Again, you cannot necessarily teach these things in a textbook. And so if there's different pathways to success or different things that we could call intelligence, maybe today's IQ tests aren't doing that great of a job in terms of actually getting at the idea, which is, back to the beginning, the ability to learn from experience, the ability to solve problems, and use that knowledge to adapt. So this isn't always about being analytical. It's sometimes about being practical and creative as well. All right. So completely shifting gears. We know that intelligence exists. What it is up for debate. But where does intelligence come from? That is a super important question. Is it nature or is it nurture? So I took this picture from a different textbook. The citation is down there. But I really like this analogy. So imagine you have a packet of seeds and you plant those seeds in one pot that is full of fertile soil. It's got fertilizer, it gets a lot of sunlight, it gets a lot of water, and you take half of the seeds, the other half of the seeds, and plant them in a different pot with poor soil. It doesn't have a lot of fertilizer, it doesn't get a lot of sunlight, doesn't get a lot of water. The same seeds is what we started off with, but clearly the ones in the fertile soil grew better. They grew taller and stronger. So what we're getting at here is that differences in intelligence between groups is largely environmentally determined. So what do I mean by groups? Well, one obvious difference between groups is based on socioeconomic status, SES. Basically, that's how much money you have and how much education you have. And what is not surprising is that people who come from more wealthier backgrounds typically score higher on IQ tests compared to people who come from backgrounds of poverty. But really what's important to consider is that wealthier people typically have better access to more enriched environments, especially in the United States. We have a huge wealth disparity in terms of education. Now compare that to a lot of Asian countries, for example. Japan, for example, the wealth disparity in terms of education is not as great. So people from poor backgrounds still get access to decent schools. But that is not the case, especially with public schools in the United States. As an example, if you go to a real estate website and look up the zip code of like Beverly Hills, a really rich community, typically real estate websites will show you the school ratings, the public school ratings. And in Beverly Hills, they're going to be ranked 8s, 9s, and 10s out of 10. Then look up a more low-income community. I don't know, like Compton, for example, just to be stereotypical. Obviously, Compton is much more low income than Beverly Hills. The real estate websites are also going to show you that the rankings of the schools in Compton are way lower. 2s and 3s sometimes. So if you have less money, you typically, on average, get less access to good schools, to better teachers and things like that. So not only is there differences in intelligence between socioeconomic status, but also ethnicity. There's certainly intelligence score differences based on ethnicity, but we know that those are largely linked to environment as well. In the United States, we are very much segregated across ethnic lines, and there is a strong correlation between ethnicity and income. Sadly, that is a very strong correlation in the year that we are in today. So that just tells us something very important. When it comes to intelligence, there is no superior ethnicity. Time and time again, researchers have shown that differences between groups like ethnicity, are largely determined by environment. So if you take people of one ethnicity and put them in an enriched environment, they're going to show stronger intelligence scores because better education is the key to higher intelligence. Now, of course, nature matters. Biology does play a role. So just to briefly to touch upon that, if you look within groups, so if we just look at the fertile soil group, within that group, some flowers are taller than others. They all came from the same seeds and they all had the same environment. So nature does play a role within groups, but nurture is to blame for differences between groups. And that is such a strong, important thing to consider about, group differences in the United States when it comes to intelligence. We need, for example, funding for education because this is the key to intelligence, according to research. All right, so as I mentioned, I wanted to come back very quickly to the idea of validity. Again, an IQ test has to actually measure intelligence to be a good IQ test. But there's one problem in particular that's worth noting, and that is cultural bias. So the idea would be that IQ tests are written by people who are often extremely well educated, and they have a certain cultural background that might be vastly different than the individual that actually takes the exam. And so therefore, the person who's taking the exam, they might have a disconnect in terms of, understanding the cultural ideas within the test itself. So therefore, the test might not actually measure intelligence as much as it measures an ability to understand certain cultural ideas. So for example, imagine you are an immigrant from a different country, and you come to the United States from a vastly different culture, and you're taking an IQ test. And on the test, there's a math problem that has it's a basic word problem. So I'll just use a basic example. So it says, Billy goes to the bank and takes out a mortgage with 0% interest. Wouldn't that be nice? And he takes out this mortgage of $50,000. At the end of the year, Billy pays back half. How much does Billy still owe? So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, it's a basic math problem. The person took a loan of $50,000. He paid back half, so now he owes $25,000. Very simple, right? But the problem is, at least what I'm trying to get at, is there are some culturally specific ideas. For example, the word mortgage and interest. If you come from a culture where the banking system is completely different than ours in the United States, the very act of being sort of distracted by these, different cultural norms could actually take away your ability to succeed on what is otherwise a basic math problem. So what we need are culture-free IQ tests, which means that every problem has no cultural norms in place, so that no matter what your cultural background is, everybody has, a fair chance at succeeding at these problems in the same way. But as you can imagine, that's really, really difficult. So that adds an extra element of, are IQ tests actually valid? Do they actually do a good job of measuring intelligence? Well, again, maybe we should go back to this first slide, which is intelligence even one thing to begin with, or is it multiple things? Because the ability to learn from experience, the ability to solve problems, and the ability to use knowledge to adapt to new situations can mean, in my opinion, so many different things in so many different contexts, especially when it comes to, different cultural backgrounds, different careers, things like that. So intelligence, I think it's an important concept in terms of the way we think and behave, but it's not one that's easily explained or even easily researched because psychologists still debate about, what it actually is. So maybe you can decide for yourself after reading more about it in the textbook, but that's some basic information about intelligence.